Ladies and gentlemen, on today's episode of Hidden History, we take you to 13,000 beautiful islands in the South Pacific Sea, where one of the most brutal massacres of the 20th century took place. Today, we take you to Indonesia. That's right. On the show today, we will be discussing what, in fact, the CIA, of all people, called one of the worst massacres of the 20th century, the coup and the devastation that followed to the Indonesian Communist Party, the PKI, in Indonesia, that ended up killing over 500,000, the range is 500,000 to a million suspected communists, and imprisoning so many more, and really setting what some call the Jakarta method into place, or the Jakarta plan, which really served as a blueprint for many of these global South countries to fight off some of their communist threats and maintain some of their power, really maintain a lot of their power and their allyship with the United States for doing so. And of course, a lot of that collaboration was with the United States. So, yeah, again, around 1 million suspected communists were killed in what many call a politicide. Some would say even a genocide. A lot of the killings were against indigenous Indonesians, and they were all associated, working class people associated with the Communist Party. This method of terror was imitated around the globe. And of course, we are deeply inspired, principally inspired for today's show. The research coming from the Jakarta method. Also, by the way, it's a great book by Vincent Bevins. That's how I originally found out about this. Also, going back through some kind of old reporting, some of the classified documents that newly leaked, and taking a look at some other scholars on this issue. Just an absolutely horrific story coming again in the kind of the context of the Vietnam War, and this is the late 60s that we're talking about, pretty much from 1965 onwards. But obviously, that's 1965 is really when it all went down. But things happened obviously in the lead up to it as well. But this is again in the Vietnam War era, the peak of the containment period. And Vietnam was obviously a big problem, a big deal for a lot of people because of these two kind of coexisting currents. This push for containment, this push against communism, and this drive to either stop or spread a push for neocolonialism, essentially. We saw with the French, the United States helping in a big way, the French in South Vietnam for a good chunk of the 50s to kind of retain control over their land and stop any of the indigenous Vietnamese forces from gaining power. Just for in and of themselves, France was an ally. They felt they had much more in common with France than they did with the freedom fighters. The United States did, but also the Soviets were breathing down the neck. They were it was increasingly becoming kind of a Red Scare type environment. Things were definitely getting more sketchy around those concerns and those debates, and so that led to a lot of fear, a lot of consternation, and a lot of intervention, but. The Viet Cong, they were, definitely an isolated group. They were definitely a more violent group, and they were not really an electorally successful group. They were a strong political force, to be sure, kind of unifying the Vietnamese against the French for a pretty long period of time, and obviously putting up a pretty darn effective fight in the Vietnam War. But meanwhile, there was a nation just to the south, which had really been unified by a pretty incredible leader, and was essentially being more and more, as the 50s bled into the 60s, being more and more led by one of, if not the most effective communist parties in the world. Definitely the biggest and most effective communist party in Asia. Probably next, I guess Russia and the Soviet Union would really be the only comparison. It was really, really remarkable stuff. But yeah, let's get back up a minute here with Indonesia. So they gained independence from Netherlands post World War II, and they were the second largest global South state, I believe, behind India. They were led by a charismatic leader by the name of Sukarno. He was a great speaker and a hard politician. He was an anti-colonial veteran in terms of fights against the French. He was definitely someone who was left-leaning. So the thing with Sukarno, again, who is this pretty left-leaning, very good, very charismatic politician, he was a member of the Indonesian National Party. And meanwhile, growing, you had the Indonesian Communist Party. Though that was one of the interests. And then on the other side, we had the kind of former colonial class, the elites from the Dutch, and also a bunch of other Western interests that had to be kind of adapted between the plantations and oil and gas and things like that. But the Communist Party here, which is one reason why I think it's very interesting to put this in the context of the Vietnam War, well, we had the Viet Cong kind of up and grabbing all the headlines. The PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, turned out to be one of the more effective and definitely one of the more moderate communist parties that we've seen. By the early 1960s, they were very effectively organized, and they had already won several elections. And nationally, the PKI and Sukarno were deeply linked at the hip. So Sukarno, it was tied to this very effective party, and also, meanwhile, winning elections and stuff like that. And meanwhile, he hosted the Bandung Conference in Bandung, Indonesia, with the likes of Jawaharlal Nehru, Abdel Nasser, and Kwame Nkrumah, as well as others. This was kind of the beginning of the Third World Movement. This is the kind of unaligned but left-leaning Third World Movement. Obviously, with the First World being the West, the United States, the Second World being the Soviet Union, which had largely left a lot of these countries, out to the wolves of the United States and the Western forces. And the Third World was essentially saying we need economic and political independence, which is really quite a remarkable movement. This is, a meeting that was pushed off and a movement that was started by Sukarno to really bring these types of people together, realizing how much they had in common and how much of a kind of effective political force they could be. That combined with the deep ties to the United States, the deep ties to the Communist Party that Sukarno had was deeply disturbing to the United States as they looked to control communism via the containment strategy and establish themselves as a global superpower in the wake of the Second World War against Russia. And again, this guy really was a very good politician and kind of a next-level threat, and one of his best skills was allowing the Indonesian communists to attain power, gradually grow their power, and was obviously closely tied to them, although not of the same party, while, again, balancing out some of those other folks. The kind of military and civil service, while the kind of officer corps, as well as just the general elite of the area. Sukarno also adeptly began to nationalize industries once controlled by the West, including those plantations and oil and gas industries. So yeah, definitely something, if you've listened to Hidden History for a second, you're probably starting to realize these are not some of the actions that would endear you well to the United States. Anyway, so this began to get people in Washington kind of talking that maybe this guy was not the best to lead Indonesia, especially as they were putting all this effort into Vietnam. But meanwhile, look, there was this just as strong, if not stronger, communist movement being supported by this guy in Indonesia as we're doing all this work. So what did they do? Well, actually, they first did something that was quite weird. This is again from the book Jakarta Method by Vincent Bevins. They actually found what is believed to be from some of these kind of leaked documents that have come out over the years. It's believed that they found the part that's believed. We know this happened, but the part that's believed, that's unsure, is the ethnicity of this guy that they found, this actor that they found to play Sukarno, I believe he was from Mexico or somewhere in Latin America. they found this guy, and they found another kind of porn actress, a Russian porn actress, kind of portray him as in the throes of the Soviet Union to Sukarno, to the Indonesian people. So they got this brown-skinned Mexican actor and this Russian porn actress to film a sex tape. They put him in makeup. They put him in a bald wig. This Mexican guy, just try and make him look like, even though Sukarno wasn't bald, they tried to make him look weak and bald. Apparently, that's what they thought, would work. And they filmed the sex tape. They ended up not releasing it because after doing just a little bit of research, they essentially realized that pretty much every Indonesian was well aware of Sukarno's, shall we say, prolific sexual appetites, and decided that it was a pretty bad video anyway, and they didn't want to release it. So instead, what did they try to do? Bomb him. That's right. So Alan Pope, an American fighter pilot, was captured on one of these bombing runs, which really began to set things off. They bombed, a few of the islands, as they were in the area anyway. Why not, send a few extra hunks of metal over to Indonesia? I think this was the thinking, I guess. And when Alan Pope, who is the fighter pilot who was captured with his American identifying documents on him, that really started to inflare a lot of, as you can probably imagine, it got a lot of people pretty paranoid, pretty freaked out on the islands. They were, especially on the left, especially kind of the working class, were really fearful of the Americans trying to make a move, trying to come after their country. Unfortunately, at the time, though, their fears were ignored. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening and supporting Newsflash. We now have a brand new way for you to be heard if you want, whether a text message or a audio message. Please, no video messages. I really just do not think that's necessary. We have a new feedback box open for you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is officially open. SWRN702@gmail.com. Send a text message, send a voice message of no more than 30 seconds via the voice memos function. Either of those two options, and we will 100%, not going to find this guarantee anywhere else. We're going to play it on the show, listen to what you have to say, and it literally could be about anything. Well, if it's inappropriate, we won't play it, but it could be about anything. Thank you so much. This is my thank you to all the listeners who have stuck out with us and want to have their own voice in the show. SWRN702@gmail.com is the address. So, at the time here, it became pretty clear that Sukarno was in a bit of a tough spot. The United States was bombing his country, which, in ordinary terms, would not make him want to be too tight with the United States. But the problem was, and this is really indicative of how powerful and how hegemonic the United States was at the time, he didn't really have that much choice other than to kind of suck up to them and be friends with them at the time because of their overwhelming military power. Vietnam was kind of caught in this tough situation as well, but it did not stop Sukarno, who understandably felt like he was in a pretty rough situation, from making continued overtures to the Soviet Union. As he did this, and U.S. hegemonic power continued to grow and expand throughout the early period of the Cold War in the 60s, two major things happened.
Two priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
The murder of President JFK, John F. Kennedy, was obviously a world-shaking event, both domestically for domestic American politics, but also for a lot of what America was doing around the globe. When JFK was killed, a more hawkish Lyndon B. Johnson was kind of sick and tired of explaining why his government was relatively chill, even though, again, they were bombing him, with what was essentially a communist government in Indonesia. That led to some changes where Johnson went to Congress and signaled he was going to change tack on Indonesia, recalling what was an ambassador put there, according, again, to Bevins, to broadly be a kind of patsy almost, to sit there and say, oh, we're not going to do anything in the United States. That's crazy. Why would you ever think that? And, of course, he would be someone who was kept in a position so that he didn't know a lot of what was going on in the coup planning and things of that nature. And this ambassador was replaced by Johnson with somebody who definitely would know and help plan the eventual coup. Then Sukarno began to beef with the United Kingdom over the boundaries of Malaysia, which they contended was drawn to weaken the left by the British overlords at the time. The U.S. was concerned by that, and especially concerned with keeping the United Kingdom happy, because they needed their support to continue to prosecute the Vietnam War. So this beef turned out to be something that was quite costly for Sukarno in the end of things. MI6 and CIA began to collaborate once again. According to classified documents, they began to train troops in Kansas. They gave them the whole 9 yards here. They took them out, gave them the true American dream lifestyle, took them to the strip clubs, took them to the bars, and also taught them how to kill American style. And a lot of these officers would come back to Indonesia, populate the ranks of the Indonesian army, and simply wait for their opportunity. Docs also said that the main focus, the main outcome of the CIA and MI6 collaborations in terms of how to overthrow the Sukarno government was pretty simple. They wanted to create a clash between one of the other main institutions in the Indonesian society, the military, and the Communist Party. It all came to a head on October of 1965. As September turned to October in 1965, action began to be put into place, essentially. Shit began to go down, all right? Yeah. Anyway, so it all started on October 1st, midnight, early hours of the morning, as rumors began to swell in Indonesia that a council of CIA-backed generals that planned to move against the popular Sukarno were essentially preparing for a coup. In order to stop this, mid-level officers claiming to stop, try and stop this coup before it happened, burst into the top general's house, kidnapped 6, and executed them. This was a massive event that shook a lot of Indonesians to their very core. Some of this chaos was just not what they were used to seeing. And the rebels then broadcast that they had killed the corrupt officers to everyone. Then both the army, which was obviously outraged by the killings of some of their top members, took up the mantle. They were led by a brigadier general by the name of Suharto. He took over and organized a counter-revolution, I guess you could say, of the army, anti-communist forces. They all come in, they take control of Jakarta, and essentially push out the long-term president, Sukarno, and essentially put him under house arrest until he dies in 1970. They essentially neutralize him in a kind of almost a bloodless way, as he really knows that all the guns are against him. It's not going to be a very pretty picture if he continues to stay for very long. He is ousted. He is put to the side. The puppet master, as they called him, the great balancer of Indonesian politics between the communists and the army, has been ousted by the army. His great balancing act had come to an end, really, before it had even truly begun. He'd been in power for a long time, for sure, but in terms of unifying the third world countries and standing up to Western influence and Eastern influence, shall we say, that was definitely a project that he was nowhere near finished with. But anyway, from here, Suharto was in charge. With Sukarno out of the way, Suharto took control and organized a big state funeral for the generals. He wanted to make this as big of a media affair as possible, And boy, did he succeed. He completely took to the airwaves and blamed this coup as anti-communist, as a pro-communist plot, and really spread anti-communist propaganda, falsely intimating a party-wide plot, which the CIA gave resources to support, according to leaked documents. Again, this was something that there is literally no proof of, which they said with conjecture. The leaders of Indonesia, the Suhartoites, if you will, at the time, essentially said that it was the fault of the communists for killing these generals instead of these mid-level officers. Maybe they were behind it. The allegations they were making, again, not really clear. The point is, communists in charge, they killed the generals. They're the ones who are at fault. We need to get them. We need to round them up, which is a very, very important part. He encouraged the we is a very important part in this, because essentially his message was, if you don't start rounding up the communists with us, everyday good, government-loving Indonesian citizen out there, we are going to come up and start rounding you up. If you have nothing to fear, turn on your communist friends, or even your just friends broadly associated with your union member friends, essentially, and report them to us. Otherwise, you will be considered one of them. It really polarized the society very, very quickly. And just like that, really the purge was underway. As we said before, in contrast to Vietnam, the legal, unarmed, but deadly effective Communist Party was viewed by some of the government the U.S. government, as a bigger threat to the containment theory and the capitalist doctrine than Vietnam ever was. Their Communist Party under Sukarno was one of the largest membership-wise and most effective. And as we discussed, the U.S. had already tried to disrupt it. Again, 25 to 30% of the country was Communist Party affiliated. So there would be a clear wedge against any new government trying to roll in on tanks and say, hey, we're the bosses now. If 25 to 30% of the country is Communist Party affiliated, deeply organized, deeply connected to far left sentiments, you're probably not going to have the best time trying to come in there and assert your power. So what they really began to realize pretty quickly, whether it be CIA, MI6, or Indonesian army leadership, is that these people needed to go. If they wouldn't tolerate the new regime, especially. So Suharto here, he led the way, but with both indirect and direct private support from the U.S. According to some classified documents, and as long ago, really, as 1990, we've heard really how the United States worked with the Indonesian army to help the massacres begin. So this is in 1990. This is a quote from the Atlantic, a 2017 article in the Atlantic. In 1990, a U.S. Embassy staff member admitted he'd handed over a list of communists to the Indonesian military as the terror was underway. It was a really big help to the army, Robert J. Martins, a former member of the embassy's political section, told the Washington Post. They probably killed a lot of people, and I have probably a lot of blood on my hands, but that's not all bad. And again, this is in 1990. An American was still saying this. 1 million people killed, many more jailed, disappeared, lucky to survive, and this is the reaction from our government. And it wasn't just this one guy. I mean, documents really showed at a high level that this stuff was known by the U.S. Not only what they were doing, it was not only supported, but, and again, as we saw, aided. They were literally giving them lists of names, the Indonesian army. We were giving them, United States was giving Indonesian army lists of names of people to round up here. It's just literally beggars belief. But they also knew that a lot of these people were innocent of any kind of real seditious or treasonous crime. The only crime they were really guilty of is being communist or communist associated. That could be down to being a laborer, being in a teacher's union, et cetera, et cetera. And these people had to go. Embassy officials received updates regularly on the executions, offered to help many, many times to suppress media coverage, and again, as we talked about, give literal lists of names. I mean, these were brutal massacres, anywhere from disappearing people to straight up throwing their bodies in the rivers in the middle of the night was on the table. They were really, though, needed to crush any democratic resistance and firmly establish the Suharto regime. And the sad thing about this is that many had really no idea what was coming to them, especially in the Indonesian society. They were destabilized by the attempted mid-level officers' rebellion when those generals were kidnapped. They were like, this is pretty crazy. We need to do something about this. And they heard their new government say, come in, give a statement. It's totally fine. It's what you should do. If you're really true, a good kind of patriotic, country-loving citizen, you should come in and tell about the people who did this. But a lot of the people who came in would never come out. These disappearances were important especially, and they were effective especially, because they spread mass fear throughout the population and demoralized it. There was no sense of closure for loved ones. They were only left to imagine what could have been done to the ones that were missing. It's kind of classic. It makes you kind of think back to the scenes in the mafia movies and just how this kind of mindset, and also just throughout history of times where people have been disappeared, of the psychological effect that it caused. Maybe he's still out there, maybe he's not. You don't know, but in the back of your mind, you really know. In Vincent Bevan's book, The Jakarta Method, he profiles a 17-year-old factory union member who was arrested when visiting her family in the late 60s and kept for decades. He highlights that she is still ostracized today and kept out of normal life by the government and the society. Because the thing is, there was no real acknowledgement, unlike a lot of Latin American countries, for the wrongdoing and the crimes that were committed in Indonesia. And a lot of it, involvement in this, being a part of it, being someone who was arrested and survived or escaped it, but was caught up in it for a time, a lot of that still can be a shameful thing, a shameful trait, a mark on your family in Indonesia, because the government and a lot of people in the state, because the government has acknowledged it, don't know and don't understand the true evil and the true nature of this witch hunt, this massacre, this genocide, some people would really call it, in Indonesia in terms of the the anti-communist resistance and rebellion and violence that was taken out. The fear of the government and its violence is so strong today, as well as the pro-government narrative, that being a victim of these massacres can be a mark of shame. You can not want to talk about it because people may judge you, may assume you're guilty of something, may look at you in a different, more negative way years after this happened, because no acknowledgement has been made. No wrongdoing has been admitted. And there's no recourse for, some sort of punishment, some sort of truth and reconciliation committee. Oh, God, forget about it. A lot of these wounds are completely unhealed because of how unknown this has been, both worldwide and especially in Indonesia. And a lot of that is through, still today, government heavy-handedness, and in some cases, open violence or threats of violence. This really sets a precedent, though, this kind of template of mass murder of civilians, kind of encouraged to pacify the population, especially when communism is a threat. This precedent was set in a very, very big way elsewhere throughout the Cold War. According to Bevins, over 20 countries used this mass murder strategy to fend off communist threats throughout the Cold War, still massively affecting their societies today. And, we saw this in so many different places, right? This goes, this constant theme that we're seeing, play out again and again through a lot of these, especially these Cold War episodes, right? And it's so perfect because it perfectly contradicts the founding narrative of modern American foreign policy, is that we are the strong, mighty, good guys, the policemen of the world. And a lot of that is formed on World War II. And that was when, we as the American army stepped in to stop what was a genocidal dictator killing millions of people. And if we hadn't come in there, he would have gotten away with it. He would have killed more than 6 million Jews. It would have been even more of an horrific crime if the U.S. hadn't stopped in. That is the story, that is the narrative that we tell ourselves. Well, here is 40, 50 years of evidence that shows us on the other side of that coin, us enabling massacres of civilians to get our geopolitical aims accomplished, and also enabling no recourse for them, not admitting we were wrong, not in any way taking steps to rectify the situation. And that goes really against the narrative that we tell ourselves. As long as we continue to tell ourselves that narrative, to tell ourselves the story of, we are the ones who are, when it comes down to it, we're not perfect, but in the end, we are the more moral people, and that we are incapable of doing something like this because, hey, we stopped the Nazis, and then kind of ignoring or not, processing or knowing about in any way the stuff that we did, from Indonesia to Guatemala to Brazil. Could be a future episode. None of this stuff will be properly accounted for. None of the wounds will be healed. And it is really, really a tragic thing. We won the Cold War when it comes down to it by enabling mass civilian slaughter and have no plans to acknowledge it or process it in any way. The only thing we still plan to do, and have been doing for many, many years and decades now, is to forget. Thank you so much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Please give me some feedback, swrn702@gmail.com. I want to improve. I want to be better so I can provide a better product for you. We're back next Friday. It's in history.